Mish-Mashing Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Today we are having technical difficulties of all kinds apparently, but the main one we're expecting to become a problem in this is some random echo on our mics, meaning that we may go quiet for some points of the stream or just try not to talk too much. Whatever it is that's triggering it, we need to look into that, and probably don't want to fiddle with our mics too much if things are getting weird. So you can expect a somewhat quieter stream this week. Last week we had visits from various relatively higher level players, along with Stinmeister, who returned and mostly chased those people off by beating them up, but stuck around to give us all a good round of practice with Guile, Blanca, and other similar characters. This week we have most of the team available, and a visit from the President as usual. But there isn't that much to talk about, as we spent a lot of time focused on other aspects of our content. For example, releasing our Guilty Gear exercises. You can find those at 2-mk.org, along with everything else that we normally do. We have 1 week more until EVO 2019, and we are expecting at least somewhat to have some data come out of that. But one way or another, we have news telling us that we will be able to play this game for free with the entire launch roster plus the Season 3 characters. So for those of us who have not had the time or in this case, the access to input Season 3 character bots, do note that in most situations we have found so far, if you do input a bot and save it while the character is available even free, it will in fact keep it basically more or less consistently. We have had a couple situations where this did disappear and did not load again, but that could easily just have been us in some way making a mistake relative to how it was saved and so on. The game does update a bit and you might need to look out for it that way, but if you need practice against Season 3 characters, I don't know if they're going to count Kage, I doubt it. But in general, if you do need some practice against those characters and do not have the bot input because you don't own the character, you should be able to get about a week of practice in that way, and if you ever choose to buy the character, you probably don't have to input the bot again. But as I've already heard a crackle in our system, and currently our lounge is basically just the team, we'll be going quiet for a while. Kazuki Dynasty is on the mic as well.
Hello.
Though we're not sure if things are on that side, and therefore we might not hear much from her other than her greeting a moment ago. But of course, if you want to engage with us about this content or anything we're doing, feel free to poke us in the stream chat as always, and we are mostly likely to respond in said stream chat as need be.
I am getting to see a little bit of my, honestly not that much in terms of sheer time, but certainly decent amount of effort and focus in Urianbot stuff, in just how frequently I'm managing to actually whiff punish Mr. President today, it seems. Oops. not the command thrown out of that. Which is honestly kind of nice because I actually wasn't expecting results that quickly at all. It will almost certainly go away if I try to think too hard about it, given what it is and how it works, some of which we talked about, but also simply the fact that that's the first stage of learning things sometimes, is you're able to do it, but you're not able to necessarily do it all the time or automatically, rather, intentionally. I need to focus on this match if I want to get anywhere. Alright then. I should probably have talked about that after the match, because that is a bad habit of mine as well. Overall, I have a bit less to say about Urian bot and all that related training this time around, since it's not quite as new to me. And while I have been practicing it and running into some difficulties, it's mostly just keeping it up.
This battle. Why? Because it is my duty. Okay.
I suppose, totally speculating really, technically, but it makes a lot of sense that if a decent amount of my training with Urian bot is also to stay in a sort of relaxed state and not be overly obsessed with focusing on the specific thing that I'm trying to do, it would probably make it a little bit easier on some level for it to translate over to something that I just automatically am doing in a match. Simply because the context, that all is the same. And so mentally, even if I'm busy thinking about some things or being stressed about, I don't know, whatever, the part of my mind that is sort of left over or free from that all can just be relaxed if I'm not on tilt or stressed overall as a whole yet. So I gain all the benefit of the muscle memory style training.
Final round. Fight.
Once again, we see the president's skill in footsies paying off with G's powerful conversions.
Round one. Fight.
They also have a good understanding of the waltz rhythm in particular spaces, meaning that he's more likely to get hit with the wheel kick than not.
Yes, we are one. Round two. Fight.
You can quite easily see here the space he specifically is trying to maintain, which makes most of the Wolf's approach options relatively predictable, and it basically comes down to whether or not there's a way for him to respond in time. I didn't actually know whether or not that could convert into super.
Not my day.
Looks like I won. All right.
Final round. Fight.
This level of confidence in play is generally limited more so by the player's execution than their nerves. However, depending on the amount of practice you've had time to do, both of those things can influence each other. If your execution starts to fail you, it tends to make you nervous, and if you're nervous, it often messes with your execution. So it's a terrible feedback loop for some people.
G wins.
While G does not have the most difficult execution, he does have quite some difficulty in perfect timing of certain things. Fortunately, this more so means that his pressure drops than that he directly loses health.
Let's do this.
That sort of execution-based feedback loop that Rillian was talking about can be quite problematic at certain times, but it can also come into play in other ways sometimes, or at least something very much like it. When I was practicing on Urian Bot the last time or two, it had been a few days since my first wave of practice, and I had, partly from that sort of fear and safety that fight internally in my mind that we had talked about in other cases, sorry, on other streams, about feeling very vulnerable in certain spaces and trying to keep myself safe in various ways relative to that. I ended up coming back to it, and I just could not find the range that I needed to stand at to face Urian Bot directly. And because I kept being too far out for my whiff punishes, I didn't necessarily know now, is this that I have forgotten which button to use? Is it that my timing is just a little bit off? Because that did make a big difference, after all, considering how whiff punishes work. Is it that I did in fact stand in the wrong place or such? And I think I realized after a bit that I was in fact standing out farther than I needed to be or should be, even though it seemed like it was exactly the right space, just for sort of similar reasons. And
Not my day. Looks like I've got round 2. Fight.
I suppose it's not only a somewhat tangential connection to the feedback loop that Rillian was talking about, but you can end up in the sort of situation there where your emotional responses will end up messing up your spacing or your timing just a little bit in that sort of way. Even if it's just spacing or some other aspect of your game as well. Or being a little bit underconfident in certain abilities or how things work in various cases. That then can make you a little bit more underconfident and cause a lot of trouble.
The honor was mine. Yes, we are one. Final round. Fight.
Some of these sorts of things are easier to deal with than others, but regardless of what it is, it can be a lot of work to fix. Especially if you have a lot of that sort of thing. But the thing that made me think of this in the first place was actually noting that I was in fact sort of just doing it against our president here. And the realization that if I thought about it or tried to do it or such, and I would probably end up having a little bit of a worse time as a result.
Let's do this.
and that therefore trying to fix that, or trying harder to do so, or trying to remember exactly where the place is that I need to be at, all of that can disrupt my muscle memory and effectively make me fail worse.
I'll fight this battle. Why? Because it is my duty. Round one.
Akuma can have some stress getting in on this character. However, his stand heavy punch and stand heavy kick are good options in any situation where he doesn't expect the president to go for his low strikes. Well, his low specials, that is. If he is expecting those things, then the easy answer is to just block and wait for them to happen, and then use either a light uppercut if you really think you can execute this and need to get him off you, or just hit with a jab or something and move forward. G as a character is extremely likely to at least sometimes get caught in the Demon Super, meaning that you don't really need to use a lot of meter against this character, first of all, and even though you can't necessarily build up too much V meter against him, mostly, even if you do use a couple of invincible moves in the match, there's a chance that somewhere in the 2 or 3 rounds you fight him, you'll have a chance to go for something really strong. Of course, this requires you to spend hours and hours practicing the input of Demon Super as a punish. He's also quite whiff punishable with this move for various reasons relative to its specific forms of invincibility. But this doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it. In fact, it is often more effective to sit on the meter while charged up. And since one does not necessarily use a lot of other tactics in this match that require you to use up your V meter as it is going down, Akuma can therefore effectively put himself into defense mode by having full meter of both types and push through whatever the president wants to do. This helps solve the difficulty of staying in on him while removing the feeling from G's side that he could try to clip your legs for free. It's never actually free, as noted, you can just uppercut him for doing it, but again, it's a matter of one type of difficult execution to get a very little bit of damage, but another type of difficulty execution to get a large amount of damage.
G wins.
Demon Super as a punish does seem remarkably difficult.
Against most characters it would be, but the interesting thing about G is that the block stun for that particular move that he ends up doing is really high enough that you could pull this off. The difficulty might actually be buffering it so you don't do it too early.
I see.
Assuming, of course, that the stress of doing it in the first place has not, like, messed with your inputs. There are also some sort of option select T-Plink stuff you can do to get it to come out, but that's obviously increasing the difficulty even more, and generally you don't want to do this to yourself. But there are ways to do the light kick into heavy punch as light kick into heavy punch plus light punch, which treats it as an EX thing. It's not really an option select because this game doesn't tend to have too many of those, but it's similar to what I've mentioned on the stream before about using inputs for certain things that mean that if you miss a direction, a different move will happen, and that different move may be useful in some way, even if it's not that great in the same situation. Moves with particularly long inputs, or with very lenient shortcut inputs, can often be messed with in this way. This is actually why some of our characters with simpler inputs don't have as much flexibility in particular spaces.
Of all the people of Earth, I have felt your power. Final round. Fight.
She is a character similar to Colleen in that if you try to play footsies with him in order to keep him from coming towards you, you'll have to keep in mind that he's nearly never coming towards you. Or if he is, the most likely thing that will happen is that his button will beat yours. Specifically, that his dash straight and dash low will hit you when you are trying to stick out buttons to keep him away from you. And then, eventually this leads you to the question of why you're hitting buttons to do this in the first place. G, like Balrog, is a lot of walking forward carefully and blocking at the right timing to prevent certain things from happening to you.
You win.
This also often means that there's a lot of psychology involved in the match. Understanding the current state of mind of the G player, so you know when to do the three most obvious things. Walk forward and block, dash forward and either hit a button or dash backward right afterwards, and jump. I don't think most people would argue that the character's anti-airs are poor. It is simply that he has enough long animations in his mid-game play that you can jump if you understand the mental state the player is in. Unlike some other characters who actually have difficult anti-airs and you might be served jumping just to keep them stressed about it, I don't think you can stress most G players by jumping. At least, not without them already being stressed. You can't start off with a calm and relatively secure player, jump at them a few times, and result in stress. It is for this reason that Kareen often ends up having to use very precisely timed Orochi to approach G in neutral. The Orochi does a good job of filling in the space where she might want to jump. At approximately the same risk, but of course not with so much of a payoff. The important thing once you're in is to realize that if it was blocked, you're going to be checked. And if you're going to be checked, you need to have a plan right after the check. Depending on your playstyle, this may be to backdash, and in some cases, it can be to use the offensive V-reversal, if your opponent is near to the corner, to push them further there and get more of an advantage of some kind. But you should measure this very carefully, as you might not have a playstyle that benefits particularly from the opponent being cornered on Karin.
Saw that coming 10 seconds in advance, but I did not have a strategy to prevent it.
That's why you should have done YOLO Super and see if you went through his.
Yeah, I really should have. Well, there's always next time. I'm sure he'll put me in that situation again.
If not today, some other day.
Yes, my current problem is that I managed to walk into his stuff a bunch.
That's
or
because
rather,
this player is very good.
to hit buttons at exactly the wrong time. He's very much ready for said
because this
buttons
player
at
is very
exactly
good.
the wrong time. Like that. I presume he's just
But
very
this is
accustomed
exactly
to my rhythm.
no, this is exactly the same as the Urian thing. You're hitting the wrong button.
I see. So I have to just figure out which one the right is. And a large part of my problem is that I'm getting hit with the fireball because I'm doing it too far away. Or I'm getting clipped when... Right, and so I'm trying to push him out with medium kick, but that's probably actually not the solution here. And what I need to do is actually manage to walk myself a little bit closer. Oh, dang it.
Kareem players, in general, your medium punch is one of the strongest buttons in this game, period. Your standing medium punch is a terrifying button in terms of both reach, what it converts into, and what you can do with it from various attack vectors that your opponent tries to do. It knocks people out of a lot of things. In fact, the entire reason why this move is not used more is because it often causes the opponent to hit less buttons, and then you don't get to punish them. But if you find yourself in this situation where you don't really know what to do because your opponent keeps on checking you, it's most likely that you need your medium punch.
I saw the first walk forward, but not the second one. He's good.
Unfortunately for our Karin, she is used to not getting to do things she needs to do. I don't know a better way to put that. But you can get caught up in the feeling that this strategy can't possibly work because it's your first order strategy and everyone knows how to counter it, or you just assume that everyone will be countering it. Don't assume this. When you've gotten to the point of being frustrated and not really knowing whether or not things are going to go your way, go back to your first order strategy and at least see what happens. Because if you don't see what happens, you're not going to be able to make new plans.
Yes, I sort of have that problem on even a little bit of a meta scale. I feel like in some situations, or perhaps matchups, I almost never learned my first order strategy simply because it would never work. For instance, I almost never use my stand medium punch, and I don't feel like this was because people would stop hitting buttons as a result, so much as I was never getting quite the opportunity for it. But as I'm building up certain skills that are adding phases of the match back to my game, I suppose I do need to reevaluate some things based on that as well.
I'll fight this battle. Why? Because it is my duty.
Okay, let's rumble.
Round one. Fight.
So Wolf, for example, has the same problem in this matchup. The first order strategy for Alex versus G is Flash Shot. It's not even a question. Flash Shot stops G from doing a certain set of things extremely effectively, and it doesn't really put him at any risk if it hits at the edge. You have to be extremely close to G for Flash Shot to fail to do its job. But if you were extremely close to G, you probably didn't have a problem.
Of all the people of Earth, I have felt your power. Round 2. Fight.
Flash Shot also has a much shorter animation total than you'd think from it. Meaning that there's not too much difference between hitting that move and hitting certain others. Above all else though, the priority system in Street Fighter V comes into play in some ways that are really important. Alex can often only hit mediums or even lights in certain positions against G when G will himself be hitting heavy and medium. Meaning that G, if he happens to have the timing, wins by priority. This is in a close neutral interaction between the two characters. If you know you have the frames, but you keep on losing on priority, check if your character has a move of similar or not necessarily equal, but the way you use it makes your opponent think about it, doesn't necessarily extend a hurt box forward until fairly late, for example. Meaning that you will skip some of your opponent's active frames, and then it will be a collision between the active frames of two moves. Normally, this is decided by the priority system, but special moves simply don't have the problem. Looks like our president has to take a break for now.
And there's a free
Then we
slot
get
if
a
anyone wishes to
different...
join.
Oh yeah, that too.
3 rounds first to 2, character select seems to be on today, and you're looking for Amara.
But we have a different Akuma this week, and interestingly their first match is against Cosmic Wolf, who has, by many standards, a similar skill setup at the moment, due to the amount of time available to practice. But, as we don't tend to judge people by their rank points, let's see what Grey Fox does in this. We're already seeing the stand heavy kick, which is a good deal of use for Akuma in this matchup, but only if Nakali is actually trying to get in. This seems to be fine, as it seems to suit Grey Fox's style, at least so far. Definitely more dedicated use of air fireballs, and definitely enough patience to possibly catch one or two disc guidance. Not absolutely sure they yet have the execution for this.
So I'm off mic for a little bit.
Meaning that in the end there's not that much to say in this particular matchup, as it's going to come down to most of the things that we've been seeing recently. But that is what Rookie and Bronze levels are often like, and partially why our bots are the way they are. Learning to punish things and recognize things are an important part of getting to the next part of the matchup, so you can start thinking about how to fight rather than the fact that your opponent keeps doing a particular thing. They don't even have to spam it. It's simply that the move is advantageous or leads to a situation you dislike in some way, and therefore every time it happens it's a big deal. It's also partially why it helps against much higher level players, but not so much against mid-level players. Higher level players are less likely to take large risks, which means you spend a lot more time dancing around in neutral until one of you makes a mistake, which you can just avoid doing for a long time if you just don't commit too hard. Or one of you takes such a risk. When a high level player does take a risk, if you are super used to dealing with the move, sometimes even their more complex setups as to how to protect themselves in the situation don't work as well.
Akuma wins. Round one. Fight.
But I will mention if I see anything that goes beyond slight spacing things and strength of punish, as both of our players seem to be getting the punish thing as a whole down. It's just a matter of how much damage is being done on each punish.
Round two. Fight. Nekali wins. one. Fight!
Was that a backdash out of the super there?
Yes. Akuma's larger super does have enough of a wind-up and enough of a spacing thing that characters with faster backdashes can't be caught that easily. You do, however, have to worry if the opponent manages to land a hit and cancel into it, as you will be in too much block stun, basically. And Akali, having already been in the trigger, would have had no way out. However, the interesting thing about that spacing was that even a blocked hit would have given Akali enough to counter with supers, so there really wasn't an option if you wanted to just go for the chip, other than maybe hitting and hoping your opponent couldn't execute their super in time.
I see. Even if it was...
It does depend on how plus you are.
Right, I was just gonna ask about that. Interesting.
But we're talking that particular form of neutral that they were playing at the time. It would have been difficult.
I suppose if you're going to get chipped anyway, backdash is not a terrible thing to just try generally. Since with the startup of supers, like including the visual wind-up, you have a lot of time to think about just how much trouble you're in as far as chip is concerned sometimes. Oh good, my lawnmower seems to have stopped. Well, for the moment.
Sadly, it looks like Grey Fox needs some very specific combos to get through this sort of thing, and they're not coming easily. Still, perseverance. Perseverance does matter. And, in the end, it also teaches us something about the player. Their level of conviction and perseverance is definitely enough that we can expect to see some very interesting things happen in this matchup, assuming they play it. Akuma as a character does have among the highest number of ways out of Abigail pressure. I mean, most people can just uppercut, but Akuma can uppercut and be reasonably sure, in at least more situations than anyone but Ken, I'd say, that he may not immediately die. And because the opponent knows he can uppercut, he also has additional things that let him do other stuff. Abigail generally can't do too much about this. It's just more or less watching your own health and gauging your risks according to either your health or your instincts. Whichever one tells you when to go in is the one to use.
Round one. Fight.
Well, similar to Sakura, a Zoni Akuma is usually better dealt with using Abigail's crouch medium kick. Not necessarily because it gets him too far in the match itself, because Akuma can jump, but more so because he kind of wants Akuma to jump. There's some big payoffs for Abigail if he can land a couple of a certain type of anti-air. He also has, among the better ways of Akuma that is, approaching Abigail in ways that lead to him not being able to properly counter. Most characters, the way their moves hit when they jump in on Abigail means that they're easy to grab, and that any move if they were having any hope whatsoever about actually continuing offense after a jump, they are going to be grabbable. Akuma can manage to continue offense without this, meaning he jumps at spaces sometimes where Abigail has to block or has trouble with the anti-air, but it doesn't put Akuma in a position where one can easily grab him or otherwise beat him up. But, as you've seen, once health is low enough, Abigail has the reach to outfootsie Akuma quite heavily if Akuma doesn't want to jump. Which means that the life lead is a big deal to this character, and technically speaking, Abigail has the life lead from round start.
Round one. Fight.
But there you see that aforementioned determination and conviction.
Round two. Fight.
Abigail's few counters to Akuma Demon Flip Throw don't really lead to much anyway. And if you're playing relatively tense footsies with Akuma, he can often see your counters coming from quite far away. Making the entire prospect very stressful. Oh, they thought it was going to kill, but it's Abigail. It never does.
benefits of having all of that extra armor.
Akuma wins. Round one. Fight.
Fighting with very heavy conviction is a good way to deal with Abigail because he does rely somewhat on being an intimidating character. Due to his relative slowness in a lot of situations, the player is relying at least somewhat on the ability to slow down the match by scaring the opponent into thinking they shouldn't do certain things. It's actually why it's relatively important to learn certain counters against him, so that you can just sort of randomly, suddenly be brave in ways that Abigail is not expecting.
Round two. Fight.
That said, the problem with the lack of health, namely that Abigail has literally more health than anyone, and even if you did completely equivalent damage at every point of the round, he will win. Means that there is some component in this to you having the same sort of effect on the Abigail player. I.e., he's a character that also needs to learn a lot of specific responses and defense. And to do so under some fairly stressful conditions.
Abigail wins.
But we go back to Akuma versus Abigail.
Let's do this. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
of the important things to remember, therefore, is that even if something gets mentioned as, oh, this works against this type of player, sometimes it means it works in a particular round. For example, when you have made your opponent try to play like that type of player, even if just for a short time. Being able to remember this is the tool to be used in this scenario is very helpful sometimes.
Final round. Fight.
Abigail does have one counter to the Demon Flip, but it tends to be extremely telegraphed. I mean, of the non-obvious ones. Back Heavy Punch and Forward Heavy Punch are also helpful, but if you're constantly getting hit by this, the main thing you need to do generally is go into his stance and hold it so that you can back roll out of the move. This does not gain you much of anything, but honestly, depending on the Akuma, this may not result in them getting anything at all themselves. And since Abigail's back roll stance itself is instant, basically, it resolves quite a few problems. The other main option he has is to just try to roll under it if the opponent is trying to do it from too close. Other than that, though, the only real hope he has is to convince the opponent that they need to hit the punch, which is basically what certain specific counters lead to, but they don't necessarily help if the opponent basically just refuses to or expects that they'll get away with it regardless, and then doesn't.
After all, what's the point of having character select on if you don't mess with your costumes a little?
Both sides of this matchup have quite a lot to work on relative to each other. In previous streams we've talked about Santerre's ability to keep Karine out with fireballs and the resultant problems Kazuki Dynasty often faces because of her style being relatively weaker to those fireballs than even most Karine. But similarly, she's often able to make up the required damage due to something Santerre has to work on, specifically knowing how and when to go in, or in certain cases hold off going in after a knockdown. So we'll be watching to see if one player can manage to not get hit by fireballs repeatedly, and if the other can manage to hold on to enough of their focus relative to knockdown situations to not use more resources than necessary. This isn't really about whether or not Santerre goes in on any given knockdown, but rather how much suppressive energy is used on an opponent who will generally be calm and watching for it once they're knocked down. Therefore meaning that most of the suppressive energy is completely wasted unless you have a full setup.
That was interesting. My mind barely registered it. Did I EX Tenko under the air fireballs and still manage to hit him with the Tenko?
Round one.
I'll have to look at that later. Or just try it more.
Round two. Final round. Fight.
You can literally see the strain in both players at this point.
It's true. Oh, dang. Alright.
And in a couple of days we're going to see a lot of strain on a lot of players in all sorts of games. Reminding everyone that Evolution 2019 is this coming weekend. And also that you can play the characters in Season 3 and the original launch roster for free entirely, starting on August 1st. Whether or not this means the game is going to end up going free to play as a total thing, I would bet not, and I would think that they're more likely to move to a model closer to Dead or Alive.
Let's do this.
Which suits most people just fine. Meaning that this is probably a nice hook to get people into it. If they're nice, they'll give you enough, like, fight money just by making an account to buy one additional character.
That really
But
would be a
it's
good way to do
difficult
it.
to say because locking off the launch roster might be a bit much. But we will see. There's really no downside to Capcom, certainly at this point in the game's lifespan, to switching to a Dead or Alive style model. At the moment, they have about enough costumes to make that work out, and enough ways to make you use the fight money you have to try to get costumes, one way or another, that if you wanted to buy other characters, you'd still have to spend some money. So, you could play a ton online in very specific modes, namely casual and ranked, to get everything for free, but this would in turn make the game very vibrant overall, since you must actually win in order to get any money from those. Still, most people who want things can manage to win some of the time, and if you can't manage to win at your current rank, just play ranked, because you will end up leveling down to other people who are at your level, and then everyone gets to play. A valiant effort. But it was towing the line to begin with, so I guess. Another hype or bomb segment. Today's outcome is bomb.
Looks like you could use more training.
Final round. Fight. Akuma wins. Round one. Fight.
As you can easily see, Santiago has been working on all sorts of techniques across multiple fighting games. And if you're not too familiar yourself, generally building up one technique in a game will help with others just automatically, even if the execution isn't necessarily related. Even if the game type isn't all that related, you can absolutely learn how to deal with certain situations in 2D games by playing 3D ones, and so on. For all we know, we could be looking at the results of playing Jubei in Samurai Shodown.
Round two.
The one thing we're definitely seeing more of is that fluidity that comes from recognizing that you failed your own execution and being confident that that's what happened. This is a very important thing for a lot of players. To drop a move but know, even as you're doing it, that you have done so, as this usually lets you prepare yourself for a blank mind state where you can respond to whatever your opponent chooses to do as a result of your failed execution. This often expands into just having that same sort of awareness when you miss, even if it wasn't specifically that you failed execution in some way. And this often leads to types of whiff punishes that you might not expect that you were able to do. Your body follows the mind, and the unconscious mind puts together a couple of things that it believes should happen. And it's not necessarily that it's doing a lot of incredible stuff where it knows it's right and just does the right thing, but often that there aren't so many wrong things you could choose, and you tend to pick the right one, or you do often enough that having this occasionally happen to you isn't that bad. You occasionally come out with a result that goes, oh good, I can do that, and you just add it to your repertoire of moves. Unfortunately, that is not among the things that have been practiced enough to easily do.
Alex wins. Round one. Fight.
Suntier has fought his way all the way back to the president, rising through the chain of command and all that. First the streets, then foreign dignitaries. But he did get to skip the mayor, so we are back to the Akuma versus G matchup. And the aforementioned relative difficulty getting in on this character due to his high ability to negate Akuma's Fireball and Demon Flip. One of the main options, as mentioned, is to dash, but it's also super risky and involves psychologically conditioning the G player not to do certain things because they're expecting other things. Suntier has mentioned in the past that getting in on defensive players is difficult, but it's more so that it's the correct time to learn that. He's just reached the point in Street Fighter where one has to learn to actually straight up get in on people. And this is where a particular type of footsies appears that's not so easily seen. Hitting heavy buttons is a good way to cause this to happen, at least some of the time. Your opponent isn't going to come into range to be hit by mediums most of the time, but you do need to hit with heavy punch and heavy kick sometimes, even if you've like max range or sometimes barely whiffed. The more important thing is to convince your opponent that you could hit them, and once you've convinced them, you might take damage from this if you actually don't pay attention. They have to react completely differently than if they just see you hitting mediums. The good part about this for Akuma is that G's whiff punishes on his stand heavy kick and stand heavy punch are not the greatest without a lot of commitment on G's part. And commitment is exactly what Akuma needs in order to get G to the point where he can be beaten up. And that is what brings us back to what I was mentioning before. Because so little of this match, except if you get unluckily knocked down, requires Akuma to use any meter, he gets to save it for various super setups. Now unfortunately for Suntier and the sheer awesomeness of the stream, he doesn't actually have strong Demon Super execution, meaning that we're not likely to see the president be taken down by the Shungokusatsu, but the overall flow is still there. The president's main plan, obviously, therefore, should be to power up as high as possible while Suntier is moving around. And this leads into a much harder skill to build. The ability to hit a button and have no attachment whatsoever to whether or not that button makes contact. For certain footsie characters this isn't that great an idea as a whole, but for Akuma it generally works relatively well. He just hits heavy punch, and then doesn't think too much about whether or not that heavy punch is going to reach the opponent. Because once Akuma does get in, and is relatively comfortable, he doesn't have to worry too much about the rest of it. G doesn't have the greatest wake-up game, and he doesn't have the greatest close range anti-pressure tools, so you'll see it happening. But the difficulty is, after playing so long in the mindset of moving in on opponents who will want to check you when you get there, and therefore you get to whiff punish them with your mediums, it can sometimes be hard to not just go in and hit those mediums with that expectation. G in turn, with his basically 2 anti-footsie tools, his bypass footsie tools, watches for that type of button and then just does wheel kick most of the time. But it's often successful for the exact same reason. But, once again, you can literally see our president reacting to the medium punch by changing his game plan immediately. So this is a long road for Suntier. But now we are going into what is probably our last on-stream match of the night. The situation isn't going to be that different, except a shift in what the player likes to hit. In this case, we now have an Akali whose basically favorite button is stand heavy kick. G can beat this by jumping more, but Akali is no slouch in the straight up anti-air you with covering this entire arc space sort of thing. Meaning that this is one of the simpler matchups to face for Cosmic Wolf in the game. The difficult part of it is that G can keep Akali fairly far away, period, and sometimes barely skillfully dance between the positions required for Akali's Seismo basically to hit. However, as a general thing, it's not that hard. G doesn't want to stay out or get in for too long, and Akali has tools to deal with all of those things. So, let's see what happens, as this match should be relatively simple. The main thing that will happen is, can you anti-air? And that is on both sides. It can sometimes make the game look simplistic, but it's a lot easier to understand once you've got all the data why almost all of the damage done in this round is going to be either clips or someone jumping. This is also why the match slows down massively at higher levels, because people get anti-aired constantly and no one really wants to jump. Akali can keep this up for a while though, and the final result will be he will get lots of V meter. Depending on the chosen V trigger, the V meter helps a lot or not at all in this matchup. G doesn't often care about Akali's V trigger 2, but he has to care at least a bit about the V trigger 1. And since Akali's use of this move is basically unlimited, he doesn't have a whole lot of options. But, baited the uppercut. Still not enough unfortunately for him, but still. No, not today. So as the president doesn't seem to even want to try playing the form of footsies that would get him hit by the stand heavy kick, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with certain things. Oh no, never mind. in this situation. Therefore, we can probably expect a lot of reliance on that waiting for the disc guidance, trying to bait the disc guidance and punish it heavily. And maximizing all outputs around that particular interaction for as long as possible. Tonight we have no guarantees on whether or not the lounge will be staying open. But there are quite a few people in it, so once nearly anyone here wishes to continue fighting, you should be able to find something if you search for 3 rounds first to 2. Character select is on, and if you're familiar enough, you know most of the team members or can catch a glimpse of them, as we are unlikely to end the stream literally at the end of the match. I can only imagine that the President saw that coming from a mile away. But that's the psychology of fighting games. We are fairly confident that we are having the Tuesday train tomorrow. And what we will not have is Wednesday content. Similarly, we are fairly confident that we will have Kame House, our Dragon Ball Fighters beginner lobby, this week on Thursday. Friday's content is a little less sure. The Guilty Gear is not quite as far as we wished it to be, which means you might get more Dead or Alive lounge action. You can find all of our bots at 2-mk.org and all of our information on what we are streaming at our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. Feel free to join our lounge for as long as it stays open tonight, but this has been Rillian along with Kanzuki Dynasty, 14 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.